Welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about communication, the role that it plays within an organization, and give you some things to think about on how you might be more effective in the way that you communicate to others in the workplace. Now, we're going to have a quick look through what is communication. We'll look at directions, methods, questioning techniques, a variety of different pieces of it. Don't forget there are two videos that are included in the materials as well to supplement with this that talk about communication. Um, One of them focuses on kind of the role that nonverbals play, but from an interesting aspect. So nonverbals are any parts of communication that are not verbal, right? So those are the tone of voice, sometimes the gesticulations, what things look like, all of those other pieces. But her take is actually that the nonverbals actually not only kind of affect our communication, but they also affect us ourselves. And that has a profound effect on how successful we are in communicating to others. There's also another piece there that talks about um, the variety of different tools that he calls out for the in your toolbox for your voice. So timbre and pace and pitch and stuff like that, as well as talks about some roadblocks that we'll talk about a little bit later too. So what is communication? Well, essentially, it's a transmitting and receiving process that depends for effectiveness upon the receiver's perceptions. So it's not necessarily about what you say, it's about what the receiver hears or perceives. And the truth is there's plenty of things that can happen between you wanting to send a message of some sort and it actually being received. And you'll see that there are filters in front of both the sender and the receiver. There are a lot more filters in front of the receiver than you do find in front of the sender, yet they can exist in both places. And we'll talk about what some of those filters are and then some strategies to try to overcome those challenges. Now, in organizations, you have communications that go from the top to the bottom, right? So this tends to be organizational vision, values, strategic goals. It's the stuff that the leadership is trying to share consistently throughout the organization. You have stuff that comes up, right? Which is kind of what we're actually finding, updates on certain projects or tasks or things like that, as well as you have horizontal communication, right? Moving between peers and from team to team. And all three happen simultaneously all the time. Communication and effectively communicating as an organization is a huge, huge challenge and a huge, huge strength, depending on how well an organization does this. How well we communicate also has very distinct cultural repercussions. The culture that's created with a very good communicating, very open, very clear kind of organization is very different than one that isn't necessarily so good at doing that. Now, when we choose to communicate, there's two major categories, right? We can write things down, whether this is physically written down on paper or electronically through emails and a variety of other things like that, as well as we can do things where we can say them, right? So they're given orally, right? So whether they're formalized or whether they're informalized. There are strengths and weaknesses to either of those two choices. There's also this, as I mentioned before, nonverbals, which is kind of the social scientist description for what we would often refer to as body language, right? And there's studies that would indicate that up to half of human communication, human to human communication, right, is actually through the nonverbals. And what we often do is we often use nonverbals as cues for either how someone is receiving our message, if they are receiving our message, how they feel about the things that we're saying, how receptive they are they engaged? Like a lot of these things we gauge from body language, which is why if you don't have that, for example, if you think when you did your presentations online, when you're presenting and basically, you're seeing screens of your other team members and then probably me, and that's it, right? And there's not a lot of, there's not a lot of nonverbals coming back. It's difficult to kind of gauge how you're doing because we do use those pieces of feedback to help guide us in our communication process. Communication can be formal, right, which is generally things that are planned, and there are informal. You'll also find that formal communications tend to be things that are written. Informal tend to be things that are oral, although that's not 100% true in either of those two cases. The reason why you would choose one method over another has a lot to do with the role that it plays in communicating. So some of the choices that you're going to make between do I do it written or oral, and within the realms of both of those, like kind of do I send it as a physical thing? Do I send it as an email? Is this an instant message that gets sent? Do I record a video? Do I do it as a voice call? Do I like any of the, excuse me, any of the variety of different choices will have something to do with the perceived urgency of the message. You generally speaking tend to choose synchronous methods of communication for more urgent messages versus asynchronous. A telephone call is a synchronous message. For it to work, both parties have to be connected. They have to be in the communication at the exact same time. An email is asynchronous, right? I can send it, you can read it now, or you can read it 2 days from now. It doesn't change it, but the two don't happen in the same time frame, right? You'll generally find that synchronous methods are usually things that you use when there's a perceived urgency. The number and the makeup of receivers, often you'll find that more and more you'll choose asynchronous choices if you have a great number of receivers, particularly if you're managing different time zones or different geographies and things like that. Same thing with how dispersed people are. The culture of the place that you work and the work climate itself, to some degree, will dictate. There'll be a preference one way or another. I know for the years that I worked at BlackBerry, I guess because like at its heart, so much of it was email based. I think as an organization, like we defaulted to email for just about everything. I mean, I watched people email each other when they were literally the next cube over. And it just became kind of the default way that a lot of communication got done. The importance or the perceived importance of the message, particularly the perceived perception, the importance of the message for the receiver, will also flavor kind of the choice that you'd make. If you had to give somebody bad news, there's somebody close to them that had recently passed away or had gotten sick or something like that, you probably wouldn't just shoot them a quick text to say that. In most circumstances, most people would think that that was kind of the wrong thing to do. And that you would try to actually have an actual conversation with that person to do it. And part of our perception of kind of right and wrong for choices has to do with the role that feedback plays. So when you're doing like a verbal communication or oral communication live, there's immediate feedback that you get from the recipient. Both actually them saying things, but very often you get the nonverbals, right? So the change in their face, the change in the body posture, things like that, as I said, which are all cues to indicate to us how a message is being received. And because of that feedback loop, you can tailor the message, right? So maybe you change some of the words you were going to use based on the feedback you're getting, or you spend more time talking about one aspect of something based on the feedback you're getting. You don't really get that with a lot of written forms. So you'll find very often if it's fairly important, that often you will communicate in a verbal and preferably in a live. Now, what you'll find often in organizations is you'll layer communications. So if you're my employee and I need to have a communication with you about some kind of a corrective action, right? So that you've made a mistake or there's something going on, I'm going to have that conversation with you in person, live, privately, but I'm probably going to follow it up with a formalized written thing that indicates what we talked about and any kind of next steps and stuff like that. So you'll find very often in organizations that you'll layer, right? You'll choose you'll make the initial communication with one format, but then you'll back it up with others. And why you would do that is because, so I want to be sensitive to the individual that I'm speaking to. And the best way I can do that is to be live and present in the moment and be able to tailor what I'm saying and how I'm saying it based on the kind of responses I'm getting from them. That's that feedback loop piece. However, I want to document what's happened so that we have a record of that conversation and we have a record of that interaction should I need to refer back to it another time. And you don't want to have something where it's, vague recollections of, well, I think it was like this. I think it was, you actually document, right? So when there's any kind of formalized part of what you're doing, you usually want to have some kind of a written documentation so that the message doesn't change. And that's one of the values of written, is that you can send the same message out numerous different places. And as long as somebody hasn't changed the document, the message itself doesn't change. The best person to send, right, or the best person for a message to come from, will have some fairly significant implications, right? So if there's a fairly major change that's going to happen in an organization, the best person to tell you that isn't your coworker. It's someone out of the leadership team, right? That's who should actually be saying that. And, the best person varies depending on the circumstance, right? If you're trying to get feedback on, how customers feel about something, the best person for that to give you that answer is the customer themselves, right? As opposed to through somebody else. Sometimes there's physical constraints, and there may be some challenges with security, privacy, and sensitivity. Often things that are secure, sensitive, are often not documented, right? So they won't necessarily be written. Or if they are, you have to have a fairly formalized process to make sure that you can control the documents and the copies of them. Often in business circumstances, if you need to have a private conversation, you have it as a private conversation without there being, necessarily any documentation of it. Because as soon as there is, it's very easy for someone to share that documentation. You kind of have to you kind of have to just expect that somebody is going to share that message. And here's a table that just gives a bunch of different things, and it gives kind of indication of which would be the more appropriate medium choices. You'll also refer to all of those things are often referred to as mediums, because they're the path through which you make a communication. Now, big part of communicating is questioning, because often what you're trying to do is uncover something. And knowing what and how to ask makes a huge difference in building rapport, which goes a long way towards actually developing interpersonal relationships. And it goes a long way towards actually uncovering, what people are actually looking for or what their impressions really are to things. Now, before you would be asking, you obviously got to figure out what it is that you're trying to know. And then, is this person or this group of people that I'm talking to, are they going to be able to answer that? Are they going to have that knowledge? Are they going to know? So you need to figure out what is it that you're trying to uncover, and who is it that you need to try to uncover it with. And then, in most questioning circumstances, what you want to do is you want to plan to ask open-ended questions. Open-ended questions encourage people to talk, right? You don't want yes, no, right, wrong, black, white, so on and so forth. Those don't lead to more understanding. You usually ask closed questions if you're trying to shut something down. But most of the time when you're questioning people, you want to encourage them to share. So you'll ask more open-ended questions, right? So if I'm looking for color preferences, right? Instead of saying, which do you prefer, the red or the purple, let's say, I might ask something about, when you see this color red, what does it make you think of? Right? And then somebody would say something and you could go, well, that's interesting. Tell me more about, where that comes from, or tell me about a story where you ran into that kind of, right? So you're trying to encourage people to share, and that's a key piece. You'll find when you're talking to people, particularly with your questioning, you have a plan for what you're trying to uncover. You do have to have some flexibility because people respond differently. and you need to give them enough space for them to be comfortable in their communication, while at the same time you need to contain how much people talk. There are some people who have real challenges being succinct, and they will go on and on and on and on and on and on. But if you shut them down too aggressively, you'll break the trust and you'll break the relationship you're developing between yourself and them, and that will limit your ability to communicate and to understand from them effectively. There's quite a skill set in learning to be able to do that. You continually kind of ask why. You can't do it annoyingly, right? Or it'll shut people down. But when somebody says, "Well, I really, why do you say that?" You know, tell me more about that. Like and there's a limit to how far you'll go. And this is one of those things that if you're questioning in a questionnaire, right, and they're written ahead of time, there's a limit to how much depth you can go into before people will just go, "Oh, forget it, I've had enough." However, if you're doing it live and you're actually talking to someone, particularly if it's in person, um, and depending on the skill set of the interviewer, you can often get a lot deeper than you would be able to get otherwise, just because of the way they ask and because of the way that they pick up on the feedback cues as they're asking the questions and as they're kind of probing a little farther. It's one of the reasons why you'll find it. I mean, the most effective questioning kind of forum is an actual in-person interview. You can get the most depth out of it. You have the immediate feedback with the verbal so that you can tailor what you're doing right away. Like there's a lot of pluses to it. Having said that, it's probably the single most expensive way to be able to do it. So you've got to kind of balance off what you can get away with in those circumstances versus time and budget and a bunch of other things like that. One of the key things you'll find as a communicator is that people will judge your words based on how you seem to present yourself. People who do not seem to be people of integrity are people that we will be suspicious of, and they are people that we will not really pay too much attention to their words, or we'll try to figure out potentially hidden meaning behind their words. One of the ways that you can be more effective as a communicator is to be empathetic in your communications, tactful, open-minded, seem fairly friendly. You do need to be genuinely yourself. And this is one of the things, in fact, that's what Julian talks about in his video, is that, I think the expression that he talks about is standing in your own truth, right? So to be honest and true and authentic goes a long, long way for people accepting you. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to agree with what you're saying, right? Because the understanding and agreement are two different things. And as a communicator, what you're after is understanding. That's principally the first thing that you're after is understanding. If you're trying to get agreement from other people, that's another step and that's another layer. You have to get the understanding part first. And we don't want to listen to people that we think are trying to manipulate us, that we think are untrustworthy, unethical, that they seem to have something going on. We won't pay attention to those kinds of people. Now, as a communicator, one of the other things that you need to be cognizant of is how engaged your receiver is, or what's their level of listening, if you will. Because how effective, back to the beginning, I mean, the effectiveness of the procedure is based on the receiver perception, not on the sender. So although I can't control where somebody is in a listening level, there are things as a communicator I can do to try to influence them to be more engaged, right? Back to the video, when Julian does his warm-up thing and he gets people to stand up and they're doing the bop, bop, bop and all that other stuff, that engagement, that helped re-engage his audience at that point in time to if anybody was starting to drift away, right, and be a little less actively listening to what was going on, that activity re-engaged them into it. So where you create participatory opportunities, right, in the communications that you have is a way to actually bring people back in. Choosing a way of presenting, the choice of language, the way you dress, things like that, all have perceptions to your receiving audience that can have a positive or negative perception on how engaged they are in listening. And there's some quick do's and don'ts for listening, which I'm confident that you can read them. What you will find, though, is that the don'ts have largely to do with issues of integrity. Um, right? So interrupting someone is disrespectful. Changing the subject is disrespectful. You know, completing somebody's statement, like these are all disrespectful and lack of demonstrations of a lack of respect and demonstrations of a lack of integrity. Feedback. So I talked about feedback as a really important piece, and it's one of the huge values in verbal communications is that instant feedback. It's difficult to get feedback in written. I mean, strictly speaking, text messaging people, there's a feedback loop that you get stuff back. You know, the challenge with text messaging is it strips out all the nonverbals. And as much as they try to use emojis and things like that to be able to put some degree of nonverbal back in, the lack of tone of voice is often probably one of the most difficult things, right? You can say the same thing, but with different tones. And then depending on the feedback from the receiver, you'll augment what you say or how you say it. And a lot of that gets lost in that piece. Anyhow, so feedback, informative, constructive, or combination of two, right? So informative is just passing information. Constructive is supposed to cause action. Often you'll find actually it's very often both, right? So you'll say something that's supposed to create an action as well. Now, I talked earlier about the filters, right? And lots of the potential roadblocks to communication come up in filters. So the first one is if I pick the wrong way to communicate, right? So if I had a relationship with somebody for a number of years and I'm going to break it off and I send them a text dumping them. Okay, that's a bad choice from a communication standpoint. Very, very bad choice. That's not going to lead to a successful communication. I suspect that they'll get the message, but I mean, the fallout from making that choice is fairly significant. You'll see differences culturally. There are some cultures where there are accepted practices for how you do certain things that may be very different than another part in the world. And so you do need to be culturally sensitive to the audience that you're communicating to and what their expectations will be culturally. Selective listening, which is something where your receiver isn't really, it often happens if the receiver is kind of engaged in the topic area, but they have a contrary viewpoint to yours that you're expressing. And they're listening for cues that they can use as ammunition to kind of fire back at you. They're not actually listening for understanding. And one of the ways as a communicator that you can try to avoid that is try to avoid communicating a message in a way that, that alerts that fight or flight kind of response in people, and try to find a way to communicate something in a way that's kind of non-judgmental so that it doesn't kind of trigger that same piece. The perception of the value of the message. If it doesn't seem to be worthwhile, often people will disengage, right? Same as if they think that you have a hidden agenda or you're manipulating or whatever, they'll absolutely disengage.